Welcome everybody. My name is Rachel O'Brien and I work on RSA's transitions projects, which I'll say a little bit about in a minute. Welcome to tonight's RSA lecture, Creating a Rehabilitation Culture. We're delighted to see so many of you here, and for most of you involved in the business of looking at the future of prisons and justice services, I think you'll agree that Professor Shadd Maruna is a bit of a hero. Certainly is of mine. We're delighted to have him here. But before I introduce Shad, I want to take up a few minutes of your time to talk about the wider context that this lecture takes place in. As some of you will know, justice services are currently undergoing the most radical changes that have been seen for some decades. And certainly what the prisons say to us is big changes have happened, but everything's changing all at once. And we're not going to go into a lot of detail, but the government's transforming rehabilitation agenda ushers in significant changes, not just to prisons, but also to probation and resettlement services. And that includes opening up what was the probation services to the market, or a large part of it. Whether one agrees with these changes or not, they look set to happen, and they'll happen fast. The timetable is for October 2015. And they come at a time when there's less public money to go round. So we find ourselves in a position of trying to do more, transform rehabilitation, and there's genuine, I think, desire to make change with less. And that raises the issue of, well, what does rehabilitation mean? We better know what it is we're trying to do. So that's the context for this lecture, but it's also the context of the RSA Transitions project, which I've been working on for about 2 years, and which is a major rehabilitation project that's taking place in East Yorkshire. I moved there about a year ago, which I think shows huge commitment. As much as I love East Yorkshire, I miss London. But I want to talk about it really for 2 reasons, not to just plug the project, which I'm quite happy to do, but first I want to sort of really say a little bit about the fellowship. And I think Transitions is an example of the inspiration that can be the RSA Fellowship. In 2011, a small group of fellows got together to produce a small pamphlet called Transitions. And it was small, but it had a big vision of the future of prisons. And the core question they asked was whether some of the Ministry of Justice's assets, land adjacent to prisons, buildings, old farms that were lying fallow, could be used more productively in easing prisoners' transition to the community. Could creating transitions parks provide a vital space next door to prisons to think and work alongside prisons, helping to drive innovation, social enterprise and work? Could they increase capacity, help expand networks and join up services? And most of all, could they support rehabilitation and help to reduce reoffending? So that was the idea. And as a direct result of that bit of work, since 2012, the RSA has been working closely, and when I say closely, it's pretty much one team at the moment, with staff, prisoners at H&P Humber, with the aim of developing a site that's next door to the prisons, 45 acres, with a lovely manor house and an old farm, that largely has been sitting there unused for 10 years, which is a travesty in my book. Ed Cornell, I can't see him because I'm sort of blanking everyone out, the prison governor there, and also an RSA fellow, is in the room somewhere. And we're really grateful to him and his team and his residents for welcoming us and working with us at H&P Humber. I'm also going to embarrass some other fellows who are also in the room, who were those original Gang of 4, Gang of 5, Gang of 6, I can't remember, who helped us develop the idea, and some of them have continued to work with us as advisors, experts and friends, if critical friends at times. We've just completed our study and the final report will be published shortly, and anyone that's interested, let me know and we can make sure you get a copy. And this will outline our plans for H&P Humber, but I think the important thing, like most of RSA's best projects, Transitions aims to be replicable and provide learning that can be exported elsewhere. And this brings me to the second reason I wanted to talk about Transitions. Having undertaken a year's research and consultation in Humber, our central argument is that prisons cannot make further inroads to reducing reoffending without developing a deeper and shared understanding of rehabilitation culture. When we say deeper, we mean understanding what this means for the individual. And we rarely ask the individual, or not enough. that go through the justice system, what needs to change, take place within them. We argue that in addressing someone's needs and where they are on that rehabilitation journey, far more attention needs to be given to their networks and relationships. We know all those that work in criminal justice talk about 7 pathways. We argue that we need to understand far more what it is that helps people in terms of the relationships, links, information, and so on that they have. And of course, they're very isolated within the prison system. And when we say shared, we mean that prisons and justice services need to become more embedded within their local communities and economies. All of this sounds really obvious, but actually when you go into prisons sometimes, some of the work, for example, doesn't match the economy outside, so we need to look at that. They need to be able to draw on the potential assets out there, including employers, communities and ex-offenders, including us. Increasing rehabilitation, one of our most stubborn challenges that has not shifted dramatically, not through want of trying, requires an equally robust and social response. Our aim is not to criticise from the outside, but to argue that the transition model can provide a necessary space, freedoms and partnerships that prisons need. And we're not there yet. In the next stage of the project, we'll work with our evaluation partners, HMP Humber, prisoners, families and staff, to explore the very idea of rehabilitation culture. But while we may have an intuitive idea of what this means, can we recognise it when we see it? Can we measure it? Can we strengthen it? And most importantly, for people like Ed Cormel here, can we operationalise it? I'm hoping that what we will hear today will help to answer some of these questions. But now to Shad. Professor Shadd Maruna is a criminologist at the School of Law and Queen's University, Belfast, whose interests include assistance from crime, offender reintegration, penal reform, and narrative methodology. Prior to moving to Queen's in 2005, Shad was a lecturer at the University of Cambridge and the State University at New York and Albany. His book, Making Good: How Ex-Convicts Reform and Rebuild Their Lives, was named the Outstanding Contribution to Criminology by the American Society of Criminology in 2001, which went on to name his Distinguished New Scholar in Corrections and Sentencing in 2004. He's a member of the Correctional Services Accreditation Panel at NOMS, and hot off the press, and you're the first people to hear this, see if I can read my own writing, he's just been, as of Friday, appointed Dean of the School of Criminal Justice at Rutgers University in New York. So please welcome Shadd Maruna.
Thanks very much. That was an extremely kind introduction, and it turns out that we feel the exact same way about each other, myself and the RSA. Not just that you're my heroes as well as the other way around, but I also think the RSA, all of you, are great criminologists. Basically, I'm here because I've read the Transitions report from 2011, and I've read, and I'm not sure if it's been launched yet, the sequel to that report, the Building a Rehabilitation Culture report. And I'm convinced that not only is the RSA writing some of the most interesting things about rehabilitation anywhere, but they're also doing it. And criminology is both theory and action, and that knowing and also doing and then learning some more is precisely how criminology is done. And I think the RSA is doing it in a very exciting way. So that's why I'm here. I'm also especially enamored with this movement away from thinking about rehabilitation as kind of the next magic bullet to come around. And this will be something that I'm going to talk about here, but to give away some of my punchline, I think too often we think of rehabilitation as this kind of reversal of everything that's going to come in this kind of magic bullet. Over and over again, we're disappointed when we find out that magic bullet doesn't actually change, give us the results that we're looking for. And what we're seeing is, of course, no single factor is going to undermine an overarching culture, the kind of overarching climate and institutional effects that you see so strongly in Alison Liebling's great research at the University of Cambridge, and I'm glad to see Alison here today, that it's not a matter of introducing a single program or a single project. We need to change the entire barrel. The entire culture needs to change if we want to see the kind of changes we should see. Crime, as we know, I've done something wrong. Crime, as we know, is nothing if not a social phenomenon. And there's kind of no more key Enlightenment understanding than that. This is from Wilkinson's great book, The Spirit Level, and simply showing the strong correlation between unequal societies and high incarceration rates. The more unequal the society, the higher the incarceration rate. And this is something we've known for a long time. The strong correlation between disadvantage and crime can be seen at every level, the individual level, the community level, the macro level as well. And again, this is straight out of Enlightenment thinking, so Rousseau, Voltaire, and the like. The key insight that has yet to be incorporated, I think, into our criminal justice thinking in a substantial way. But that is, if crime is a social phenomenon, then surely our response to crime, and rehabilitation being our primary response, needs to also be a social response. And I think that's one of the exciting things about the RSA's approach. And it's also exciting to be in such an Enlightenment era organization like the RSA talking about this, and this got me thinking I should riff on this notion of enlightenment, so I changed my title ever so slightly, creating an enlightened rehabilitation culture. The Enlightenment, in many ways, never came to criminal justice. Like the RSA, the field of criminology was born in the Enlightenment, and it also is inherently an Enlightenment exercise, an enterprise. Yet we work in a sort of surreal parallel universe where the work that we do largely doesn't affect, it largely has no impact on, and for reasons that go two ways, the broader workings of the criminal justice system. The Institute director at Cambridge, Lawrence Sherman, recently said justice still remains largely unenlightened, and I think he's right about that. Now, of course, this isn't to say the Enlightenment didn't impact criminal justice. We had, of course, Beccarian, and in many ways he's been called the father of criminology, the father of penology. And one could ask, well, didn't his classic of Crimes and Punishment in 1764 essentially do away with the barbarian forms of justice from the Middle Ages and herald a new enlightened criminal justice system? That's how, of course, we're taught it in textbooks and introductory lectures to criminology. But there's little evidence that that's actually true. There's no question that Beccarian was enormously influential. It was a hugely influential book at the time that he wrote it. He was immediately lauded by the sovereign powers at the time. And that influence has never really died since then. Not that anyone still reads Beccarian's original work, but we've essentially been living with Beccarian's justice system since 1764 in many ways. It's not an exaggeration to regard Beccarian's work as of primary importance penal reform for the last 2 centuries. Yet Beccarian was a deeply conservative figure who sought to create a criminological system which evaded the difficult questions, the revolutionary questions that were inherent in Enlightenment thought. Essentially, his legacy to the field of criminology, but more importantly to criminal justice systems around the world, was to create the massive bureaucracy that we currently have. Essentially, despite his reputation as a great reformer, Beccarian basically developed a modest, derivative, status quo preserving carve-up of Enlightenment justice that basically preserve the sovereign's right to punish excessively through a vacillation between utilitarian deterrence theory and a bit of non-limiting retributivism thrown in. Yes, he was successful in reforming the practice of torture, although not corporal punishment, which he advocated in the book. He did have an impact on the death penalty and judicial discretion, but he was very much in favor of the use of punishment and imprisonment in particular, and instead put the power of a punishment into the hands of the state in such a way that nearly guaranteed that punishments would increase, not decrease, in the name of the common good. And of course, this has been the legacy. This is Graham Newman writing about Beccaria's legacy. He says, and it is a self-indulgent assumption to believe that the changes brought by the Enlightenment are in any way morally better or more liberal than the period before it. It is impossible to tell whether prison, as it is massively used today, is a milder punishment than various corporal punishments, even the death penalty, that were used in the 18th century. And it is even less possible to guess whether more or fewer people are punished today than yesterday. So this is the challenge. Instead, the justice system we have today, evidenced by the fact that we use some of the same buildings, like Pentonville Prison, envisioned by Bentham, Beccaria's protege, and others, is still largely the same as it's been for 200 years. We're caught in a kind of Beccarian cycle, I would argue, and I'll develop that argument in a moment. This isn't to say, and the RSA is clear about this in their reports, that innovative, important rehabilitative work, forward-thinking, Enlightenment thinking doesn't go on inside the walls of our prisons today. Of course it does. I wouldn't be here if it doesn't. It keeps me going at the work that I do. But the work is patchy, it's piecemeal, it's unsupported, it's fragile, and most importantly, it's often hidden from wider views, in many ways purposefully so. To do good work, to do rehabilitation work, we think it has to be done out of the sight of the community, of the wider public, and in particular, of course, the tabloid media, for fear that it will be displeasing to these masters, which is hugely ironic. And what's worse is it didn't have to be like this. During the Enlightenment, there were a number of other voices besides Beccaria's that were taking the same source material, Hume and Rousseau and Voltaire, Locke and the like, and making an entirely different argument about what justice should look like. William Godwin, the husband of Mary Wollstonecraft and father of Mary Shelley, argued, for instance, that the deterrence-based arguments in Beccaria's work could justify the most execrable tyrannies. He argued that crime was a product of unjust societies, and therefore to conceive that compulsion and punishment are the proper means of reformation is the sentiment of a barbarian. Now, had Godwin's vision, or Hume's or Rousseau's, become the dominant Enlightenment vision of justice, who knows how things might have changed. So there is a chance, a moment, I think, an opportunity for a new Enlightenment thinking around justice, an alternative Enlightenment, maybe a true Enlightenment vision of what justice could and should be. And I'm encouraged in that sense by the sheer numbers here today. I also got a list of all the people who are here in this room, and it's a remarkable list. There's people here from User Voice, the Forgiveness Project, Big Society Capital, Transform Justice, the New Bridge Foundation, the Cabinet Office, and it's hard to not see a list like this, see a room like this, and not be excited that we're on the precipice, perhaps, a moment here in the UK, and indeed elsewhere, including the United States, where there's an opportunity for a new kind of thinking around rehabilitation, a new way of conceiving of enlightened criminal justice. But then again, we have to be careful about this thinking. As a criminologist who studies rehabilitation, I admit to finding myself awfully excited and somewhat confused by the announcement 3 or 4 years ago now of Ken Clark's rehabilitation revolution. And now, of course, we're in a moment of transforming rehabilitation. Rehabilitation as a concept and every criminologist was taught this, was officially deemed dead as recently as the 1970s. This was the moment of justice model thinking in the UK and the US and elsewhere, but also it was a time of nothing works, the idea that treatment and training has had its day and should be replaced, or that since we know that custodial sentences will not achieve rehabilitation, rehabilitation should no longer be an aim which sentencers have in mind when sending people to prison. In criminology, we're taught this story that rehabilitation was killed by a study done by a researcher named Martinson back in the 1970s. It was replicated in the UK by Stephen Brodie in his review. But Martinson and his colleagues in the 1970s were asked to review all of the available evidence on rehabilitation research, and in doing so, they came to the conclusion, put more eloquently at times by Martinson, that we know very little about what works, which came to be known as the conclusion that nothing works in rehabilitation. And this became a very important and landmark sort of study. Martinson did the rounds of news programs and the like. The press was enamored by this study, and of course, criminologists hated the finding. To many, Martinson became a kind of hate figure, and many of us spent a number of decades trying to disprove this notion that nothing works, and created the what works movement, which eventually changed from the question mark to the exclamation point when we decided that we know what works in reforming offenders. Of course, the truth is that Martinson's research didn't cause the end of the rehabilitative ideal. Martinson was in the right place or the wrong place at the wrong time, perhaps. He caught a much wider wave, something that was going on in the public. The great David Garland says that this account that penal change, the decline of the rehabilitation ideal, it was caused by the criminal justice systems of the day waking up and realizing that rehabilitation didn't work, he says, is a modern version of the fairy story of Enlightenment reform. And again, that theme is back. Garland says, the wave that Martinson caught was something he calls late modernity, and he tells a complicated story in the book about what was really going on in the 1970s that led to this wider change. But by the 1980s, we were getting books with titles like The Decline of the Rehabilitative Ideal, and one of my favorite quotes from the great criminologist Richard Korn: "No one but an academic simpleton would even use the word rehabilitation without apprehension." Well, look what's back. The idea of rehabilitation is back, not just back, but back in the form of a revolution. So reports of rehabilitation death have been greatly exaggerated. And even if, and maybe especially if, this is rhetoric, that it was just a press release, this notion of the rehabilitation revolution, it makes it all the more puzzling why and how we got back to this place where this once dirty word, a word that only an academic simpleton would use, is suddenly being used in headlines and press releases. And again, not just in the United Kingdom. The great state of California that once went to the trouble of removing the word rehabilitation from its penal code in the 1970s, changed its Department of Corrections to the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, just to reiterate and make sure everyone gets that theme in the work that it's doing. So what's going on here? I call this the English patient question. This is a reference to my viewing of this film that came out a few years ago. This is a film about a guy on his deathbed that won some awards. I went to see the film in a theater with a friend of mine, and I just remember thinking to myself, how long is this going to last? And my friend must have been thinking the same thing, because about 4 or 5 hours into the film, she just blurts out, "Just bloody die already," which got the only applause of the film that showing. And this question of how long is this going to last? How long and why won't rehabilitative ideal just bloody die already? Well, there's one argument that came from Criminology itself. There was an article here that came out in the Journal of Criminology, our premier journal, and it was written by the then president of the American Society of Criminology, who he delivered this as the annual presidential address to the field, and the title was "The 12 People Who Saved Rehabilitation: How the Science of Criminology Made a Difference." And in that article, he makes the case that essentially, the case that I've just been made for you today, rehabilitation was dead as a philosophy. Everybody believed that nothing works, but that had been changed in recent years, and that the change was down to a small group of 12 criminologists, mostly from Canada, a few from the United States, who rejected the nothing works professional ideology and instead used rigorous science to show that offenders were not beyond redemption, that treatment programs rooted in criminology could work, oops, where am I? And we're able, therefore, to reduce recidivism through this process. Now, everything that Cullen says in this argument is absolutely correct in the sense that criminologists were doing outstanding research on rehabilitation, and there was this change in public perception, public acceptability of rehabilitation as a concept. What he doesn't make the case for is that this is a causal relationship, and that this research was the final push to change this rehabilitative shift. And I would argue that much like Martinson in the original, that this is probably more a case of correlation rather than causation. I don't think that either Ken Clark or the governor of California, Arnold Schwarzenegger at the time, were reading the research of these 12 criminologists when they decided to bring back rehabilitation into the rhetoric of the popular discourse of their day. So we suffer this Enlightenment fairy story, as David Garland calls it, something of a white horse problem in criminology. This is this excitement that comes where there's sporadically a new project, a new program that gets marched out. This is what I call the magic bullet phenomenon, where individuals get very excited about certain bits of research and believe that this is going to lead the way to change. And inevitably, when we see that it doesn't, there's a backlash against this, and we become cynical, and we fall into cycles of nothing works as well in this same English patient way. And there's something intoxicating about this question of what works, this sense of holding the keys to something that's so distressful and stressing to the wider community. To have the answer to the crime problem is a very tempting one, and it's one that's easy to fall into. There's routinely, the media picks up on a new criminologist with a new idea, and they will draw on the image of the new sheriff in town, and it's almost always this white upper-class male riding into this big city environment of urban decay and turning around its crime problems with the powers of big science. And I think that's a real problem of Enlightenment criminology. It's also a problem for the media and the criminal justice system more widely. And I think what we're seeing here is a response to this kind of criminological hubris that leads itself into these cycles of inevitable cycles of disappointment and cynicism. And again, to go back to Newman on Beccaria, he blames Beccaria as the original reformer on this history that we have of these sort of fleeting success followed by abysmal failure, both personal and institutional. I had a very personal and interesting response to this in a blog that I do on criminological thinking, where I was making a similar case to what I was making, and I was talking tonight, and I was talking about Martinson and the what works problem in criminology, and I got a remarkable response from Robert Martinson's son. Martinson himself is no longer with us. His son is now in his 40s. And he responded to my blog to say, hi, I saw the comment in your blog and that the word works does not work when talking about human lives. What does it even mean? This was my argument that I was saying we need to abandon this notion of what works because it inevitably leads to these cycles that I was talking about. He says, well, I know a rhetorical question when I can see one. I have to answer that I can agree with the first but not the second point of the question, and for essentially the same reason. He says the word work certainly means something, and what that is not hard to discover. Simply, what will have a reliable result? What government expenditure Y will produce result Z? What set of inputs will produce a consistent set of outputs? So this is the kind of the holy grail we're looking for with the what works question and Enlightenment criminology. He said, explicating this question this way teases at the larger problem inherent in the enterprise of what works, which is that impersonal forces and persons remain definitionally different. The sociology essentially is not physics, or at least it's not Newtonian physics, to predict the discrete behavior of objects under stress, because the human is a subject which only violence can reduce to an object. I hope you're still following. This is all a response to a blog. What a smart gentleman. He says, to Martinson's surprise, his father's surprise, his generation decided that violence, mass incarceration, was the only reliable tool to get Newtonian results in a world of stubbornly quantum human individuality. They solved the non-scientific problem of human choice and freedom by refusing individuals both en masse. They answered his question of what works definitively, at least for his generation, but the question was not meaningless. It was loaded. So Martinson's setting us on the trail to find this magic bullet of what works essentially found it with mass incarceration. It was the only perfect, what does he call it, force expenditure Y that will produce result Z. The only way to get those kind of Newtonian results consistently and across all contexts is incapacitation and locking people away for long periods of time. And in many ways, that's a Beccarian solution, and it's one that has led to these kind of problems that we talk about, of which I don't have time to get into in great detail. But the incarceration solution feeds itself a wider cultural change. This correlation that we see between inequality and incarceration is supposed to show the damaging effects of incarceration, of inequality on incarceration, but it could also show the other way around, that mass incarceration can lead to greater inequality in society, and it can do that in a number of ways. But we know that mass incarceration has increased inequality, it's increased poverty in society. It does this by impacting the children of prisoners in negative ways that are shown in Joe Murray's recent research. It also impacts on the communities that prisoners are drawn from in consistent and predictable ways, as Todd Clear shows in his book on imprisoning communities. It's reduced marriage rates, it's weakened labor markets, it's served as a source of negative attitudes toward the justice system more widely, according to Todd Clear's research. And of course, most importantly, it creates an underclass of individuals who are themselves socially stigmatized and excluded from the mainstream, who go through the prison service. So the culture the incarceration creates feeds on itself. It creates its own inequalities and culture of punitiveness. And we see this in our own research. Hence, the excitement around the RSA's language of talking about creating entire cultures of rehabilitation. This is from the new report soon to be launched. Making further headway in rehabilitation, they say, is too important to leave to prisons, justice agencies, or top-down government approaches. They're quick to say this isn't to imply any criticism about these groups. It's simply to say, nor to claim that we've got a magic bullet in the RSA.
It's rather to say that a better response to reoffending is much more likely to emerge when the collective we is moved into action. That is, the magic bullet alone, or any individual group within a prison or a justice agency, isn't going to create rehabilitation. If rehabilitation is a social problem, if crime is a social problem, it needs a social solution, that collective we being moved into action. We see this in classrooms all the time. There's a great deal of research in the education area looking at the creation of positive, the creation of hope within classrooms and optimism that we see that we can manipulate teacher beliefs in students. And you see a self-fulfilling prophecy effect when teachers believe in their students and what are called Pygmalion effects, students come to believe in themselves. And we've seen dozens of different studies confirm this idea both inside and outside of the classroom. We've seen it in nursing home studies where if you can raise caretakers' expectations for residents' health outcomes, residents of nursing homes actually have raised lowered levels of depression and actually live longer in these environments. We've seen this in the workplace and in business schools and courtroom studies and numerous other examples of this. Steele and Aronson call this, one of these effects, a stereotype a threat, and have demonstrated how situational reminders of negative stereotypes about one's group can lead to lower performances on standardized tests and other outcomes, and the reverse as well, that higher expectations can consistently lead to higher outcomes. Perhaps my favorite study in this regard was done by Leake and King in the 1970s. They were working in an alcohol treatment clinic and they devised a fantastic experimental study. They told the staff working in the alcohol treatment clinic that they had developed this accurate tool that could predict who will and won't succeed in the treatment program. There was no tool, it was a complete fiction, and instead they chose the names at random of who they said that the tool had decided were the most likely to succeed. And then a year later, they went back to the clinic to see who had succeeded, and sure enough, those who were on the list were much more likely to succeed than those who weren't on the list. That even though there was no instrument, that power of persuasion, the power of the staff believing they were going to be the most likely to change, led those people to believe in themselves and that they could change. And it's this kind of climate, this kind of social rehabilitation process, and not a process of risk, not a process of suspicion or deficits, but a process where institutions and communities, most importantly, believe that people can change and they support those change processes to happen within our institutions. So giving the last words here to the RSA report, again, they decided that rehabilitation is something that all of us want to see, but it eludes us. It is a social benefit that requires a social response. And they argue that the transitions offers one way of mobilizing this. And that, to me, struck a really important chord. I think the Enlightenment vision that I would like to see for justice is one based on this notion of shared guilt, shared responsibility for crime, and also shared responsibility for rehabilitation. This is from a 1971 article on redemption and politics, where Roger Smith argues that unlike punishment, which mobilizes our sense of virtue and sets us apart from the transgressor, forgiveness arouses in us and depends upon a sense of shared weakness, a humility that comes, that we are moved to forgive out of our own need to be forgiven for what we have done in the past and what we may do in the future. Forgiveness, unlike punishment, moreover, depends upon a life of common values and concerns. And I think that is precisely the Enlightenment vision that the RSA is trying to create with transition. So thanks very much, and we're happy to take any questions.
Thank you for a fantastic speech with a lot in it. We're running a little bit late, so I'm going to take some questions, sort of 3 at a time, but I'm going to cheat while you all kind of line up your questions and ask one myself, which is if we're on a precipice, which sounds quite exciting, if scary, what can push us over? You know, we've got lots of people in the room here that are interested and are working in this area. What kind of things can actually take us over the precipice? That's the right phrase.
And I should start with that. I mean, obviously, it's the classic, you can't waste a good crisis. The economic situation has brought us here in lots of ways to thinking about rehabilitation again. I mean, you could, rehabilitation may come in times of plenty, and it may come in times of relative deprivation, and at this point, it's certainly the latter case. And I think the idea of the traditional justice system as a kind of bottomless pit of resources and money that can be thrown, that there's essentially no limit to how the public's appetite, and Ian Loader compares it to ice cream and the inability to stop with punitiveness. I think that kind of feeding of the justice machinery ended with the economic recession, collapse, and gave us this opportunity to change the way we think about justice. Whether it's going to, you know, there's nothing about a crisis that leads us in this direction, and this would take sustained work. It would take the kind of grassroots work that organizations like those in this room and the RSA are better at. But I think it was a trigger for forward.
Okay. Right. If you've got a question, put your hand up. There's one up the back there, and there is a mic coming to you, and then one here on the right, and I'll take one over from this side. Anyone? If I stare at you long enough? We'll take those two, and one up the back afterwards.
Hi. Thanks for your talk. It's really interesting.
Can you all say who you are?
Hi, my name's Sonia. I'm from the Royal College of Psychiatrists. And I found your talk really interesting, but it seems that there's a huge, and this is kind of following on from your question, Rachel, but it seems like there's a huge disconnect because there seem to be these programs in the community, but there doesn't seem to be any policy into putting them in action. And it seems like, you know, that I think it was during the London riots, I think it was something like there wasn't a riot in Leeds, and a lot of people said that it was because there was a really effective community rehabilitation program there. And so obviously there's programs out there that do exist, so I just don't really understand what's happening. I don't really understand why there is such a disconnect, basically.
Come back to that, and it was here.
Tony Amatrudo, I've just got a couple of remarks. You went on about Martinson. You didn't mention Andrew von Hirsch, who I think is a much more substantial figure altogether, and certainly in the sort of Enlightenment tradition coming out of sort of Kantian thinking. And it wasn't a sort of rejection of rehabilitation whatsoever. Andrew wrote a book on rehabilitation, very supportive of it. But the issue was, what is your justification for punishment, and that rehabilitation can conflict with the more important consideration of desert. And that's it. That's my point.
And one more.
Delbert Sandiford from Hertfordshire Probation Trust. I welcome what you say about culture, but no organisation is responsible for culture. That's quite a wide societal thing. So organisations have got to function on what they do, the specific interventions that they make. And we know from all the research done by the Ministry of Justice what the effectiveness has been of particular programs. You know, for example, that at one extreme, getting people into work delivers the biggest result in terms of reducing reoffending. We know that getting people off drugs might be less effective. So we do have a list of things that work to different degrees. There is no magic bullet. I think one of the big problems we do have is that even though we know that work gets people out of reoffending, we don't have the political will and the courage to tackle that. I talk quite a lot to employers about this, and they all agree with me how useful it would be and how sensible it is to get people into work, to get them off offending. But when you ask them how many people you actually employ, they back off. Some of them have excellent policies for working with offenders, but like, for example, the NHS, but actually they have a culture of risk averseness. So that's part of the problem, that people have good intentions, but when push comes to shove, nothing happens. And we have ministers and we have politicians who wind each other up on this matter. If a politician sticks his neck out and says we're going to get people into work, the opposition says that's a load of crap, because what about the people who are good and not doing anything offensive? You should be handling them rather than the people who have been criminals. So we've got a real problem here, and some of it has to be tackled at a political level.
Right. The disconnect question, which I'll come in on as well. I'm not going to attempt to address the von Hirsch question, and then the gap, I think, between the intentions and the policies, and it's a bit like the disconnect thing. How do you support that change on the ground?
Yeah, all great questions. You're welcome to jump in on any of it, but Sonia's question on why do we see such differences here and there and not building in a systematic way, I think gets at really the key issue here. I mean, this is how, in a sense, innovation is a good thing, and letting 1,000 flowers bloom and experimenting with different projects in different places is exactly the right approach to rehabilitation or any other problem, but it only is the right approach if you're constantly learning from these innovations, and instead we don't. We have the flowers blooming hither and thither, and they're not building to anything greater, and the flower dies, and the people change, and I'll stop the metaphor mixing here in a moment, but people move on, and we don't have the historical memory of what went on at that place, because we don't have some would say a social scientific understanding of rehabilitation as a practice, but also it gets to the political will question of, because it's a dirty and embarrassing thing to be helping people in these places, it's not celebrated, it's not picked up upon, it's not mainstreamed and so forth, because to do so would be politically dangerous and put us at risk in various ways. So these things happen, and they don't grow and don't build upon themselves. So.
Can I be a little bit more optimistic?
Okay.
I mean, I take the point completely about here, they're both related, but I also think part of the problem is we think we need permission. And we think we need that policy support, and sometimes just getting on and doing it, and it's not easy and so on. But and I slightly disagree with the issue of culture. Cultures can change in institutions first. They can change amongst workforces. They can change, in very small organisations. They can change in areas. So where we've sort of landed with quite a small project team, really, the driver of that cultural change has been the prison that we're working with. And that is absolutely critical, that part of the responsibility, I think, is not to shriek at prisons, that when we talk about prison reform, go and work with them, because actually they're already tapped into, there are all those other bodies, whether it's police and crime commissioners, probation trusts, and so on. So culture I quite like your gardening analogy, you can actually foster something that can begin to change the context in which you work. And I think partly, government's not going to change because of one project or whatever, but you get on, you prove the case, and if we are driving a wave, if there is a wave of change, to be optimistic and go and get your hands dirty and work on the ground can make a difference, and mobilising people is part of that. So slightly over-optimistic, but...
No, that was going to be my answer to the third question. But the second question, Andrew is a good friend of mine. I'd like to think that's mutual. I completely agree. The movement in the 1970s away from rehabilitation both had to do with the empirical Martinson and nothing works, but also a normative, a theoretical argument based around just desserts and a limiting retributivism that Andrew was a primary theorist around. And you're absolutely right that people like Andrew, and we don't need to personalize it too much, but retributivists often are supportive of rehabilitation in many ways, and in fact, in its purest form, retributivists, and Andrew in particular, would be strongly against the kind of collateral consequences of punishment that says, yes, there should be a proportional response, retribution to a crime, but if that is carrying on, if the person then comes out of prison and he can't find a job because of restrictions on employment, if that person's family is suffering, if all the kind of collateral consequences that I went through in that process are happening, then that can't be justice. That's not just desserts, and I think that's the truest sort of notion of rehabilitation and its original meaning of that term. At the same point, I'm not a retributivist, and partly because the historical story isn't a good one. When we've had these waves of renewal of interest in that retribution, and most importantly in the 1970s in the US and then the 1990s here, we've seen waves of mass incarceration follow in their wake. And I certainly don't blame Andrew, although he was living in the US in the 70s and then moved here in the 90s, for that process. But it's an undeniable process, and it's partially because the retributivists are legal scholars and they live in libraries. They don't live in prisons and institutions, and I worry that retributivism doesn't give our justice system the kind of the fuel it needs to do good. I think the idea of punishing an eye for an eye is difficult to put into practice. It's the right theory on a kind of to a philosopher, but in practice, what do a just desserts prison look like? The results have been ugly, kind of like some of the pictures I put up there. When prisons lose that ambition that what we're doing should be about changing people and rehabilitation, I think danger's afoot at some level. And then the last great question about how do we change the political climate around these things. You mentioned, yes, there is good research about some programs, and in particular you mentioned jobs as being a crucial one. I think jobs tap into the RSA's notion of rehabilitation as a culture, that it says it's not all in the individual's head. The job connects a person to a wider culture. It gives them a way of means of living, to put a roof over their heads, but also it connects them to in lots of positive ways, to positive role models, and gives meaning to life and structure to life, and these kind of things. So I think there's no surprise there that involving employers is a crucial one. And as you say, some of the main impediments to doing that are political ones. They're about changing, and we finally got some change on the Offender Rehabilitation of Offenders Act that is helping some more people get back into employment after being involved in crime. But we need more work like that to do that. And yes, it is a matter of political will. It is a matter of changing public opinion as well, and I think I'll just echo Rachel's answer on that. The best way to do that, and I've done some public opinion research as well as criminological research, is to get people involved in the justice process themselves. People who are the closer people get to justice, depending on the role you put them in, but certainly in volunteer rehabilitative type roles, the more progressive they become in their views. And I think we see the same thing with politicians all the time. The best way to change a politician's view on crime is to send them to prison, and that's probably a good idea in 90% of cases. So.
That's one solution. Right, I'm going to take another three. One over here, lady in the pink. One in the middle. Oh, no one in the middle. Oh, wow. Here, and this young man over there. Do you want to go first?
Yes, thanks. Can you hear me, yeah?
Yes.
Thank you. It's Helen Cash. My question's around the issue of support. At some point, when you were offering support to people who are rehabilitating, there's got to be some conclusion, otherwise you're creating dependence. And for any of us to succeed at anything, we need to take some responsibility. So really, I just wanted to explore your thoughts on how we enable people to develop their own success by taking some responsibility as well.
And
It's Peter Dawson, work at Sodexo, one of the organisations that standing on the edge of the precipice. Before I jump off, I mean, is there any piece of equipment you would suggest I strap on?
And a final question here. It's just coming.
Hi. My question's more about so as you mentioned in this report, probation is being privatized and put out to the market. My question's really about how you build contracts to ensure that the suppliers are incentivized to do what's best for the offenders. And I see here that it talks about there's a payment by results method, but if you go into further detail, could you go into further detail about how that would work on the ground? Because I know with unemployment benefits, you know, you had certain suppliers just focusing on the people that they thought would be most likely to get back onto the system and ignoring the people that needed it the most. So yeah, just a bit of questions about that. Thank you.
Off you go.
I'll talk about that piece of equipment to strap on.
I think the second and third are related.
Let's see. So the first question, Helen, on dependency. You're absolutely right. I didn't have time or didn't give this talk tonight, but I'm a great believer in that, and a lot of the research that I do on rehabilitation suggests that one of the key factors in success is the development of self-efficacy and this sense of personal responsibility, both for one's successes and one's failures that you talk about. And I think the way to do that is to move away from a kind of deficit focus in our rehabilitation, which says offenders are these people with all these needs and all these risk factors, and we need to target those and change those and correct them, to one of fostering strengths and the kind of responsibilizing that suggests that as the RSA talks about, prisoners and probationers are people with potential, people with capabilities, people with an obligation to society and something to give to society, and that we should use our rehabilitative mechanisms to let them demonstrate this. That if a society only sees individuals as asking for help, recipients of care and welfare, they may get our sympathy for a while, but our sympathy runs thin. I think it's important to give every individual an opportunity to let them show that they can make contributions, and that is a fundamental notion of rehabilitation. It's rehabilitating their reputation as someone who's harmed others to show that they can also contribute to communities.
Can I just jump in on that? I agree completely with the sentiment, but the other side of that is we've done an awful lot of research with both prisoners and ex-offenders, and the most transformed people you meet are those that have been through the prison system and are now often working voluntarily in the justice system, not paid, not able to get jobs. So, there is a challenge the other way around, which is the people that are supposedly independent are often struggling really hard to get those jobs that are out there, and actually often putting their time, paying back, because they've learnt a lot through their experience. And I think, again, for those employers in the room, agencies and so on, actually volunteering is great, but what we should be doing is taking them on as paid staff and treating them as they are our colleagues and so on. So I think there is another angle to it. Now to the transforming rehabilitation questions. What should Peter invest in as he flies over the precipice?
Well, I've gotten most of my good ideas from Peter, so I feel a bit silly. You could create a restaurant like the Clink and have communities coming inside our prisons to see what prisoners can do and humanizing both sides and a number of other innovations like that. in terms of explaining what's going to happen with payment by results, you know, I'd need a whole lecture and probably somebody else to give it to. You know, I'm not gonna go there in too much depth, although the question itself suggested a lot of wisdom, and that you already know some of the answers. You know, we really, with any huge innovation, talk about white horses and magic bullets. With any huge innovation like this, we really need to go in with evidence, and the best evidence we have is how this has worked in other sectors, and where we've got all these concepts like creaming and a number of other of these words that have been invented to explain just how folks game around these payment by results measures, and I think you're always going to get problems like that, and I think you know, we need. I wish it wasn't happening so quickly, but if it is going to happen here, we're going to have to be ready for these, and the. You know, the measurement of reoffending as the key to the results is something that needs to be looked at in lots of ways, and a number of criminologists have looked at this. We know it's a particularly bad measure in lots of ways because the measure is dependent on so many other things, but it's the one we're stuck with in lots of ways. But we need lots of other measures and lots of other protections built in to make sure that we don't get that kind of game playing that you're talking about from providers and the like. But overall, you know, on the positives of it, it is, you know, I like the idea of holding groups responsible for outcomes. I like the idea of being focused on rehabilitation and the kind of innovation we're going to see as a result of this. I just think it's probably happening much too fast and far too politicized in lots of ways.
Okay, we're to time, but I think we might run a little bit. Nick, a question from you, and then one in the middle. Anyone? We're going to take two over there, the young lady there, and then one young lady over there. Nick, sorry.
Oh, thanks. I'm Nick Hardwick. You were both pretty relaxed about standing on the edge of a precipice, and I suppose it depends on what you think's at the bottom. And I think objectively, you would say the prison system now in England and Wales is under, you know, a lot of strain, and you see that, I think, in the number of incidents that are being reported. You see that in the current kind of squeeze in the population, and in other ways as well. And so I'd be interested from Helen about, you know, what impact that's having on the work you're doing in Humber Prison, and about whether that is having an impact. And I'd be interested from Shad about the danger, it seems to me, is that what might be, you know, while people might disagree with elements of it, quite a widely supported sort of rehabilitation agenda and culture and the sorts of things you're talking about, actually getting blown off course and defeated, not because the ideas themselves are bad, but because the climate that you just referred to, the very politicized climate in which they're being implemented, is so hostile and unwelcoming. And therefore the idea itself gets disparaged, when actually, whether it works or not, may not be to do with the rehabilitation concepts employed. So there's a very sort of practical question to Helen about what's happening with the work you're doing, but more to Shad about how you protect, I suppose, the rehabilitation concept in what's a very hostile climate at the moment, I think.
Okay, I'll come back. And there was the young lady in front of you. Take that one as well.
Thank you. My name is Ellie Cumbo. I work for Clinks, which is a charity that supports other voluntary sector organisations working with offenders. Before I worked at Clinks, I worked at victim support. And my question is about the divide, which in my opinion is a false one, between offenders' rights and victims' rights in the system. I think part of the public and the political hostility to rehabilitation comes from the false perception that any rehabilitative culture is somehow an encroachment on the rights of victims. Perhaps the more controversial part of my theory is that I do think those of us who are pro-rehabilitation have at times played our part in that by seeming quite dismissive of the idea that victims too can be treated very unjustly by the system, and that a progressive justice system should be able to rehabilitate both. And that victims' rights means more than a guilty verdict in every case and the harshest possible sentence. So is my theory complete nonsense? And if it's not, how could we build a justice system that does that for both?
Thank you. And then, there's one more over here.
Hi, I'm Bailey Aaron, CEO of Spark Inside, and my question was, if you could propose 3 policy initiatives to the government to enhance a rehabilitative culture and support people leaving prison into economic self-sufficiency, what would they be?
Oof. Right. I think I'll defer that one over. I'm just going to come back on the practical question. I mean, just to remind people, the precipice was a positive one or a negative one. It was, if we are at this moment of rehabilitation, coming back, but I absolutely take the point. I mean, in terms of working with HMP Humber, I mean, that not only is the transforming rehabilitation change going through, HMP Humber was 2 different prisons from July whatever it was. So that team has been through, in both prisons, been through years of uncertainty, austerity, and then more. And the practical implications are things like don't do a staff survey about skills and aspiration in the middle of that process. So we've had to just be really practical. But I suppose we know that because we've got a relationship with the prison. So I think that's the key thing is, if I was redesigning the project, I'd go and sort of just live there for 6 months before I do anything, because you find out a lot. And one of the things you find out is officers, and I don't mean rehabilitation, those that you don't have to argue with, officers, once you dig deep, they want to make a difference because they're human beings, and human beings want to make a difference. They don't want to see those kind of pictures we saw earlier. And actually, they're not asked often, they're not recognised as that. They'll go to the pub and people say, you lock the key at the end of the day. So digging at that and really bringing, and a lot of people are doing work in that space. I'm going to leave the policy ones to you, but I just wanted to, on the victims thing, completely agree. And I think part of the problem with the criminal justice debate, it has at its worst become a kind of self-righteous sort of ditch on one hand, or the kind of Daily Mail on the other hand, and government sort of somewhere in the middle, and I think we are in a different space now. But when you look at what victims say they want more and more is rehabilitation, because what people don't want is other people going through the same thing. And actually, where we're working in Humber, restorative justice is a really big part of the strategy locally, and victims are absolutely critical to that. So when we talk about mobilisation, actually victims can be your first in the queue. They can be the people that could really persuade others that the evidence works, and this is the kind of projects you need to see. But I agree that sometimes it hasn't sounded like that. Okay, over to you on changing the world.
Yes, you guys are making us work tonight. Let's see. The first question, how do you protect the excitement of rehabilitation in a hostile climate? And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it has all of the makings of the kind of boom and bust cycle that we've seen just too many times. That sort of English patient idea that I was talking about. When we have a society that's not signed on, sort of a media and a political climate. You've got backbenchers, frontbenchers who are still not signed on to anything like a rehabilitative Enlightenment sort of rehabilitative culture. And then you've got this very risky political change happening. I mean, it just seems a recipe for the first couple of failures, immediately the pessimism and the lock them all up sort of response to that. So I think you're absolutely right. I think the second question also right in the sense of the kind of the zero sum. If it's good for offenders, it must be hostile to victims. And again, the tabloids are masterful at doing that with any kind of innovative project. They'll bring in a victims group who a spokesperson will be offended and shocked that this is going on and the like. I think, and then maybe for the third question about the 3 initiatives for government, I think restorative justice, for all the damage that's been done to that movement by, and I've written about this, by its kind of marginalization with low risk and juvenile offense situations, they still holds, still remains one of the most dramatic and powerful opportunities I think we have, because precisely because it involves victims of crime who are strongly in support of restorative justice when they participate in it, precisely because it involves communities, and we know how important that is in terms of changing public opinion as well. So I think I would list restorative justice as one of the things that I would take to government, because it gets at some of that. It disproves that zero-sum argument that you talk about. The other one that I would list for sure is justice reinvestment. Justice reinvestment, for those who aren't aware of it, I won't be able to give great detail, but look it up, Google it tonight if you like. Many of you, though, will be very familiar with it, and I think the justice reinvestment idea has caught fire at the moment because of the timing, because how economically sophisticated that argument is. It's basically, in a nutshell, the idea that communities themselves, like the ones I was talking about, who are the most impacted by mass incarceration, should be allowed to choose themselves whether they want to use the millions that are spent on incarcerating low-level offenders, if they wanted to use that money in other ways to make their communities better, safer places than incarceration. So it's sophisticated on economics. It's also sophisticated on involving the community in justice and bringing justice back to the people and away from the kind of the machinery, the bureaucracy of the state. And I think that's a really good idea in terms of this buy-in of culture that we're talking about. And then just off the top of my head, but because it's always on the top of my head, I think the third policy initiative I would go with, and I look forward to your answer to these as well, Rachel, is user voice-like, and not capital U, capital V, but small u, small v, ex-prisoner-led organizations who, by their very nature, just by being led and run by ex-prisoners, already build a rehabilitative culture, build in a legitimacy of rehabilitation, because these are individuals who are living, breathing role models of change, who when they go in, and I know the RSA is working a great deal with ex-prisoners and their work that they do, and I think all sorts of organizations are recognizing this at the moment, and I think a coherent kind of philosophy around the user voice is starting to develop, and so those would be the 3 I would try to get in. And you really only have something like 30 seconds when talking to policymakers, they say, to get your point across. So if you got all 3 of those in 30 seconds, I think you'd be doing well. But,
and I'm going to completely cop out, so I kind of agree with all of that and above. But I'm happy to share other ideas over a drink, because we've come to the end. So I just wanted to say, please do come, and thank you for coming along, and please do come and join us for a drink. We're in the Benjamin Franklin room, which is directly downstairs. But first of all, I want to just say a few thank yous. One for really, really good questions, really hard questions, and also to RSA fellows in the room, but also elsewhere, because none of this happens without RSA fellows. Every event that happens because of them, as well as those that have been involved directly with the project I've been talking about. I want to thank those fellows, but also the transitions team at HMP Humber, who, they're doing their job up there while we're sitting and talking about it. And I think that's worth remembering. And finally, our funders, Esme Fairbairn Foundation, the Tudor Trust, and Garfield Weston Foundation, which have been really, we wouldn't have got through the last year without them. But finally, please make a really loud noise to say thank you to Shad for coming all this way and talking to us.